Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a painful season, wondering if God has forgotten you? You're not alone in asking the hard question that echoes in hospital waiting rooms, divorce proceedings, and late-night conversations with yourself. What is the point of all this pain? TOZER, that profound seeker of God's heart, understood something that most of us miss in our suffering. He knew that our deepest pain often signals our greatest preparation. TOZER spent his life distinguishing between surface-level faith that crumbles under pressure and the authentic spiritual life that actually grows stronger through trials. He taught that God doesn't waste our pain, but He does something far more significant with it than we could ever imagine. Today, we're going to explore 3 unmistakable signs that your current suffering isn't meaningless wandering, but purposeful preparation for something greater than you've ever experienced. These aren't just comforting thoughts to make you feel better about hard times. These are real indicators that God is actively working in your circumstances to prepare you for a calling, a blessing, or a level of spiritual maturity that requires exactly the kind of preparation you're going through right now. When we look at the landscape of modern spirituality, we find ourselves surrounded by messages that promise easy paths and quick fixes. We're told that faith should make life comfortable, that following God means avoiding pain, and that suffering indicates we're doing something wrong. But TOZER lived and taught during a time when the depth of spiritual truth wasn't diluted by the desire for instant gratification. He understood that authentic spiritual life often looks completely different from what we expect. TOZER observed that the people who experienced the most profound encounters with God were often those who had been through the deepest valleys. He noticed that suffering had a way of stripping away the superficial layers of religious practice to reveal the authentic hunger for God underneath. This wasn't a theological theory for TOZER. He lived it. He watched it happen in his own life and in the lives of countless others who discovered that their most painful seasons became the doorway to their most powerful spiritual breakthroughs. In our culture today, we face unique challenges that make TOZER's insights even more relevant. We're surrounded by distractions that numb us to spiritual reality. We have endless entertainment options that help us avoid the deep inner work that suffering often demands. We live in a society that sees pain as something to escape rather than something that might contain divine purpose. But what if our perspective is completely backward? What if the very thing we're trying to avoid is actually the pathway to what we've been searching for all along? TOZER understood that God doesn't cause suffering for the sake of causing pain, but He certainly uses the suffering that comes into our lives as raw material for transformation. The question isn't whether we'll face difficult seasons. The question is whether we'll recognize when those seasons are actually preparation for something greater. The first sign that your suffering has a greater purpose becomes clear when you notice that your pain is creating an unusual hunger for authentic spiritual connection. TOZER taught that comfort often breeds spiritual complacency, while difficulty awakens a deeper thirst for God. Think about how this works in everyday life. When everything is going smoothly, when relationships are easy, when finances are stable, when health is good, most people don't spend much time in deep prayer or serious Bible study. They might maintain religious habits, but there's rarely that desperate, seeking quality that TOZER identified as the mark of authentic spiritual pursuit. But when life gets difficult, when circumstances press us beyond our ability to handle them with our own strength and wisdom, something changes inside us. We stop being satisfied with surface-level spirituality. We stop being content with knowing about God from a distance. We develop what TOZER called a thirst that only the living God can satisfy. This isn't just emotional neediness disguised as spirituality. This is the recognition that human solutions aren't enough for what we're facing. This is the awakening to the reality that we need something more substantial than positive thinking or good intentions. When your suffering creates this kind of spiritual hunger, it's often a sign that God is preparing you for a deeper level of relationship with Him than you've ever experienced before. Consider Sarah, a successful marketing executive who thought she had life figured out until her husband left unexpectedly after 15 years of marriage. For months, she tried to handle the emotional devastation with therapy, self-help books, and staying busy with work. But nothing filled the deep emptiness that had opened up inside her. It was only when she found herself crying out to God in genuine desperation that she discovered a quality of prayer she'd never experienced in all her years of church attendance. That desperate seeking led her into a relationship with God that became the foundation for a completely new direction in life, including a calling to help other women navigate crisis with authentic faith. The hunger created by her suffering became the doorway to purpose she never could have imagined when life was comfortable. This spiritual hunger that emerges from suffering is different from the casual interest in God that characterizes much modern spirituality. It's urgent. It's personal. It demands real answers, not just comforting platitudes. When you find yourself moving beyond surface-level religious activities toward genuine seeking, when you're no longer satisfied with spiritual entertainment but crave authentic encounter with the divine, you're experiencing one of the clear indicators that your suffering is serving a purpose greater than just making you miserable. The second unmistakable sign that your suffering has greater purpose becomes evident when you start developing what Tozer called spiritual muscle that you never possessed during easier seasons. Tozer understood that just as physical muscle develops through resistance training, spiritual strength develops through spiritual resistance. The comfortable Christian life, while pleasant, rarely produces the kind of spiritual strength that can handle real challenges or step into significant calling. Think about how this principle works in practical terms. A person who has never had to trust God for provision develops different spiritual muscles than someone who has learned to depend on divine supply during seasons of financial uncertainty. Someone who has never had to forgive deep betrayal develops different capacity for grace than someone who has walked through the painful process of releasing genuine hurt. Someone who has never had to maintain faith while watching prayers go unanswered for months or years develops different perseverance than someone who has learned to trust God's timing even when it doesn't make sense. When you're in the middle of developing this spiritual strength, it often feels like weakness. It feels like you're barely hanging on, like your faith is more fragile than it's ever been. But what's actually happening is that your spiritual life is moving from dependence on favorable circumstances to dependence on God Himself. This is exactly the kind of preparation that God uses when He's getting ready to entrust someone with greater responsibility, deeper calling, or more significant ministry. Consider David's preparation for kingship. His time as a shepherd wasn't just about learning leadership skills. It was about developing the spiritual muscle to trust God's protection when facing lions and bears alone in the wilderness. When he later faced Goliath, he wasn't drawing on theoretical knowledge about God's power. He was drawing on spiritual muscle that had been developed through real encounters with danger, where God's protection was the difference between life and death. That same spiritual muscle carried him through years of being hunted by Saul, through the moral failures of his reign, and through the complex challenges of leading a nation. The spiritual strength that develops during suffering seasons often feels unimpressive while it's developing. You might feel like you're barely surviving, like your faith is hanging by a thread. But what's actually happening is that you're learning to access divine strength in ways that people who haven't faced significant challenges never experience. You're developing the kind of spiritual endurance that can sustain long-term obedience, the kind of trust that can weather extended periods of uncertainty, and the kind of humility that can handle both blessing and disappointment without losing its center. When you notice that difficult circumstances are producing greater dependence on God rather than driving you away from Him, when you find yourself discovering divine strength you never knew existed, when you realize you're handling challenges that would have devastated you in previous seasons, these are clear indicators that your suffering is building something valuable inside you. This spiritual muscle isn't just for getting through your current situation. It's preparation for whatever God has planned for your future that will require exactly the kind of strength you're developing right now. The third and perhaps most significant sign that your suffering serves a greater purpose emerges when you begin to develop genuine compassion and wisdom that can only come through personal experience of pain. Tozer taught that God often allows His people to walk through valleys not just for their own growth, but to prepare them to guide others through similar terrain. There's a profound difference between theoretical knowledge about suffering and the wisdom that comes from having navigated real loss, real disappointment, real fear, and real uncertainty while maintaining faith. This experiential wisdom becomes one of the most powerful tools God uses to impact other people's lives. Think about the difference between a counselor who has studied grief in textbooks and a counselor who has walked through profound personal loss while learning to trust God through the process. Both may have valuable insights, but the person who has experienced the reality of loss while maintaining faith carries something that can't be taught in a classroom. They understand the specific ways that doubt attacks during sleepless nights. They know what it feels like when well-meaning friends offer advice that feels completely disconnected from reality. They understand the difference between genuine comfort and empty platitudes. They've learned which promises of God hold weight during the darkest moments and which ones feel abstract when you're in actual pain. When God is preparing someone for significant ministry to hurting people, He often allows them to experience the kind of pain that creates authentic compassion rather than pity. Pity looks down on suffering from a position of superiority. Compassion sits beside suffering from a position of understanding. The person who has learned to find God's presence in their own darkness can guide others to that same discovery in ways that someone who has only known spiritual sunshine never could. Consider the ministry of those who work with addicts. The most effective recovery counselors and sponsors are typically people who have walked the path of addiction themselves and found genuine freedom. They understand the specific ways that addiction lies to the mind. They know what real recovery looks like versus what it appears to be on the surface. They can distinguish between genuine change and manipulation because they've lived both sides of that equation. Their ability to help others isn't based on theoretical knowledge, but on hard-won experiential wisdom. Similarly, people who have navigated depression while maintaining faith can offer hope to others in ways that people who have never experienced mental health challenges cannot. They know what it feels like when spiritual disciplines feel impossible. They understand the difference between spiritual dryness and clinical depression. They can offer practical strategies for maintaining connection with God when emotions are unreliable guides. Their words carry weight because they're speaking from experience rather than theory. When you notice that your suffering is developing within you, a deep understanding of what other people experience in their pain, when you find yourself able to offer comfort that goes beyond surface-level encouragement, when you realize that your own struggles have given you insights that you never could have gained any other way, these are strong indicators that God is preparing you to minister to others who will face similar challenges. This doesn't necessarily mean formal ministry or professional counseling. It might mean being the person in your family who others turn to during crisis. It might mean becoming the friend who can offer real support rather than empty optimism. It might mean developing a calling to work with specific populations who struggle with issues you've learned to navigate. The practical application of recognizing these signs requires a fundamental shift in how we approach our difficult seasons. Instead of seeing suffering as something to endure until we can get back to normal life, we begin to see it as a classroom where God is teaching us things we couldn't learn any other way. This perspective doesn't make the pain less real or the struggle less difficult, but it does provide a framework for finding meaning and purpose even in our hardest moments. When you're walking through a challenging season and you recognize these signs at work in your life, there are specific ways to cooperate with what God is doing rather than just surviving until it's over. First, pay attention to the spiritual hunger that difficulty creates. Instead of immediately trying to fix or escape your circumstances, spend time in genuine prayer and Bible study. Not the rushed, distracted kind of spiritual activity that fits around everything else, but the kind of seeking that comes from real need. This is often when people discover that the Bible isn't just a collection of nice thoughts, but a source of actual guidance and comfort that speaks directly to their situation. This is when prayer moves from routine religious activity to genuine conversation with someone who understands exactly what you're facing. Second, notice the spiritual strength that's developing through your challenges. Keep a journal of the ways God provides for you, guides you, comforts you, and strengthens you during this season. You'll be amazed how quickly you forget the specific ways that divine help showed up during difficult times once those times have passed. Recording these experiences creates a history of God's faithfulness that you can refer back to during future challenges. It also helps you recognize that you're developing spiritual muscles you never had before. Third, be intentional about allowing your experience to develop compassion rather than bitterness. This is a choice that has to be made repeatedly during difficult seasons. It's natural for pain to make us self-focused and defensive. But when we recognize that our suffering might be preparing us to help others, we can choose to let it soften our hearts rather than harden them. This might mean actively looking for ways to encourage others who are facing similar challenges. It might mean volunteering with organizations that serve people dealing with issues you're learning to navigate. It might simply mean being honest with trusted friends about what you're learning through your struggles so they can benefit from your hard-won wisdom. The key is approaching your suffering as a student rather than just a victim. This doesn't mean being grateful for pain or pretending that difficult circumstances are enjoyable. It means recognizing that even painful experiences can become valuable preparation when we're willing to learn from them rather than just survive them. When we look at the broader picture of how God works in people's lives, these three signs begin to make sense as part of a larger pattern. God's preparation often looks completely different from human preparation. We prepare for challenges by trying to avoid them, or by building up resources to handle them with our own strength. God prepares us for His purposes by allowing us to experience our own limitations so thoroughly that we learn to depend on His unlimited resources. We prepare for leadership by gaining credentials and developing skills. God often prepares leaders by putting them in situations where conventional wisdom doesn't work, and they have to learn to hear His voice and follow His guidance even when it doesn't make sense from a human perspective. We prepare for ministry by studying and training. God prepares ministers by allowing them to experience the very problems they'll later help others solve. This divine preparation process rarely feels encouraging while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels like everything is falling apart. It feels like God has forgotten us, or like we're being punished for something we can't identify. It feels like we're moving backward rather than forward in our spiritual lives. But when we understand God's pattern of preparation, we can recognize that what feels like falling apart might actually be the process of being rebuilt for something greater than we've ever experienced. The person who has learned to trust God's provision during financial uncertainty is prepared to step into callings that require leaving secure employment to follow divine direction. The person who has learned to maintain faith during extended seasons of unanswered prayer is prepared to intercede for others and to persist in spiritual battles that require long-term endurance. The person who has learned to find God's presence during depression or anxiety is prepared to offer hope to others who struggle with mental health challenges. The person who has learned to forgive deep betrayal is prepared to help marriages heal and families reconcile. Your current suffering might feel like a detour from God's plan for your life, but it's more likely the pathway to a plan that's greater than you could have imagined when life was comfortable. The spiritual hunger, the spiritual strength, and the experiential wisdom that develop through difficulty become the very tools that God uses to accomplish His purposes through your life. This perspective doesn't minimize the reality of pain or suggest that we should seek out suffering. It simply recognizes that when difficult seasons do come, God has a remarkable ability to transform them into preparation for purposes that make the pain worthwhile. The question isn't whether you'll face challenges. The question is whether you'll recognize when those challenges are actually preparing you for something greater than you've ever experienced. If you're currently walking through a difficult season, take a moment to honestly evaluate whether you're seeing these signs in your own life. Are you developing a hunger for authentic spiritual connection that goes beyond surface-level religion? Are you discovering spiritual strength and resilience that you never knew you possessed? Are you gaining compassion and wisdom that could help others navigate similar challenges? If you can identify any of these patterns in your current circumstances, it's a strong indication that your suffering isn't meaningless. It's preparation. And if God is preparing you, it means He has something in mind for your future that requires exactly the kind of preparation you're receiving right now. That's not a promise that everything will be easy from now on, but it is a promise that your pain is serving a purpose greater than you can see in the moment.